So sustainability refers to the degree to which a competitive advantage is captured and sustained. You might recall from the first session, this idea that being good at something is not necessarily a competitive advantage. A competitive advantage is when you are better than other competitors within a segment. So being good is not necessarily good enough. It has to be better than others. What we are concerned about, first and foremost, is imitability. Think back to our first principle of business strategy here, the fundamental principle. If others can do it, then it's going to be very hard for us to make money here. If others can copy what we're doing, then we're going to expect there to be heavy price competition, lowering prices, shrinking our margins. So we need to ask ourselves, can others do what we do? If we go to this idea of a VRIN analysis again, this is the rarity and inimitability conditions of a VRIN analysis. For a capability to provide sustainable competitive advantage, it must both be rare, others must not already be doing it, and it would be much harder to imitate. There must be barriers to imitation to prevent others from copying what we do. So what are some potential barriers to imitation? First, some of these are many that we talked about when talking about industry structure. Legal barriers, things like copyright, trademark. These can provide a legal right that makes it hard for others to imitate what you do. You look at Disney. They have a superior capability that gives them a long-running sustainable competitive advantage in the intellectual property they own around their characters. Going back to Mickey Mouse and to more modern-day characters rising out of their Pixar films, they have legal barriers that allow them to persist and have a competitive advantage. A second thing to consider is controlling scarce supply. In real estate, the old adage, location, location, location. You think about restaurants. Having a superior location for your restaurant could be a significant competitive advantage, especially since others might not be able to imitate that location. In New York City, Tavern on the Green, a long-running restaurant in the middle of Central Park, obviously a preferred location that gave them a unique competitive advantage. A third thing to consider is whether those capabilities are developed over a unique historical path. We've talked before about learning curves, the idea that over time you learn how to do something better. That can provide a very significant barrier to entry as you learn how to do things well and then others struggle to catch up with what you do. I've mentioned Intel in this context before. The idea that Intel has learned a lot about microprocessors that have moved them down that learning curve and made it very hard for others to imitate their strategy, imitate their capabilities. It might very well be that there's just some unique moment historically in their evolution that gave rise to a capability that would be hard for others to mimic. In the case of Southwest, Herb Kelleher, the original CEO, talked about a moment very early in their history where they had to sell one of their planes. At the time they only had 3 planes. They had to sell one and go down to 2 planes. And as a result, they decided, let's keep the same number of flights but do it with less planes. And that was the genesis of their 15-minute turnaround. They basically, out of necessity, had to figure out how do we turn these planes over quickly so we can keep up with the same number of flights even though we only have a limited number of planes to do that. A fourth thing to consider are the degree to which these capabilities are socially complex. This is the issue of things like culture again. Culture is a very ambiguous concept, hard to get our hands around, yet it's that very ambiguity that makes it very hard for others to imitate. To the extent the culture of Southwest is so important to their success, very hard for others to fully grasp and understand and observe what is their culture, how do they reinforce and create that culture, and therefore, if it is a source of advantage, very hard for others to imitate. Similarly, to the degree that the value they create is delivered from tight combinations of networks of capabilities and resources, this can also pose a barrier to imitation. Think back once again to Nucor. That reinforcing loops that they create make it very hard for others to imitate. In more high technology industries, we see often the idea of network externalities. This is the idea that as others adopt a technology, the technology becomes more valuable to you. Classic example is a telephone. The value to the first person who had a telephone is not very high. But as others adopt the technology, the value to that user goes up. A more recent example would be Facebook. Facebook captures value by the fact that as more people adopt them, the more valuable being on Facebook becomes. And as a result, it creates an incredible barrier to imitation by others. While technologically other companies could figure out what Facebook does, it was very hard for them to penetrate that market now, given that they've established this huge network of subscribers at this point. Last but not least, you like to think about the credible commitment of a firm to a course of action. Pankaj Ghemawat has been a scholar who's really highlighted this potential barrier to imitation. In this case, it might not be that others can't imitate you, but they choose not to because you've taken a strategic action that, once again, is hard for others to desire to want to copy. So let me give you an example. There was an interesting interaction a few years back between Boeing and Airbus in airplane manufacturing. Both of them had announced plans to develop a jumbo-class airliner. If you've seen these now, Airbus has one that's a double-decker, literally 2 stories on an airplane. Huge plane. Well, arguably there's a market for these airplanes. However, there wasn't enough to justify 2 manufacturers building these very large aircrafts. So there was an interesting game where the 2 firms were going back and forth, basically trying to communicate to the other one that they were going to move forward with this. But it was only when Airbus could truly credibly commit to building the large airplane that Boeing backed off. Now, interestingly enough, Boeing backed off and decided to go with their Dreamliner, which is a smaller, more energy efficient plane, and some would argue that they made the better choice than Airbus at the end of the day. This idea of credible commitment requires 2 things. One is scalability. If they can be used to keep others from exploiting the expanded opportunity. In the Boeing-Airbus case, this was the issue that there wasn't a market for 2 of these large planes. One of them could satisfy all the demand. If you can't satisfy all the demand, then it's not going to prevent others from copying you. And they have to be limited to this purpose, the specificity here. If you could change what you did to another course of action, well then, obviously it's not a very credible commitment to say you're going to go one way versus the other. A historic classic example of this is when Cortez came to the New World. At least how the story goes, Cortez came over with his troops, he took them off the boats, he turned around and promptly burned their boats. Why did he do this? Well, the argument was he changed their option set. He changed what strategic actions were available to them. No longer was retreat an option. It was either fight and win or fight and die. Credible commitment at the end of the day. So we've talked about imitability. Now let's talk about durability. Can we maintain our capabilities over time? Will they degrade or become obsolete? So some things to think about here. Clearly, human and physical assets tend to degrade over time. If you think about a brand new manufacturing facility, eventually it will get older and not be state of the art. Human assets clearly degrade over time. I like to make sports analogies when thinking about this. If you look in the 1990s in the US, the premier National Basketball Association team was the Chicago Bulls. And leading the Chicago Bulls was Michael Jordan, arguably the best player in the history of the NBA. Now, Michael Jordan was an asset that created value, created capabilities for the Chicago Bulls that gave them a competitive advantage in the marketplace that was the NBA. However, over time, as it happens to all of us, his skills will degrade. He gets older. So that valuable asset one day becomes less valuable over time. Southwest Airlines is actually interesting in this context. Herb Kelleher, their original CEO who served for many, many decades, was viewed by many to be the linchpin to Southwest's success. It was Herb that set the culture, it was Herb that set the strategy moving forward for that firm, and the fear was that when Herb Kelleher stepped down, that everything would be lost with Southwest. Now, fortunately for Southwest, that has not been the case, but you get the idea of the degradability of assets. Steve Jobs comes to mind now with Apple. Obviously under tragic circumstances, him being lost. There's an asset again that was lost for Apple Computer. Second thing to think about, sometimes core capabilities come what we call core rigidities. The success that a firm achieves breeds complacency, risk aversion, myopia. All of these things lead firms to no longer take the necessary actions to renew their capabilities moving forward. And history is littered with successful companies that have failed to continue to renew and update their capabilities. General Motors in the U.S. automotive industry has been criticized for this concern. Sometimes these core rigidities arrive because the valuable capabilities of today are no longer valuable tomorrow. They become obsolete in some way. Back in the 1950s, Swiss watchmakers were the envy of the world. They had a superior capability to deal with small mechanized devices, springs and gears and the like. Back in that time, we had wind-up watches. Well, what happened? A technological innovation, quartz-based technology, digital watches comes along. And in a very short period of time, these companies who had these superior capabilities found their capabilities obsolete. We saw the rise of Japanese manufacturers of watches enter the market and dominate. Now, as many of you know today, Swiss watchmakers have come back. They've leveraged their capabilities and quality and the like to make a foray back into the industry. But for a while there, they very much suffered from this change in technology. We'll talk more about this in the next session. Finally, thing to think about is that some assets, though valuable to you, may actually be more valuable to others and thus worth selling. So let me use a sports analogy again, and you see this quite a bit internationally with soccer players, is that the value of a certain soccer player may be worth more to another team than they are to you, and therefore you could sell that asset for money that you could use to help build your capabilities in other ways. So it's often useful to think about, are there assets that we have that have a higher opportunity cost than us holding them? Basically, could they be worth more to others, and then we could leverage them into expanding our capability base and our asset base in some other way.